Hello, mindfulness class. Thanks for joining me. This will, of course, be a pretty brief lecture, so I'm glad you made it this far. We are in now chapter 10. For those of you keeping track, this is week 11 in our syllabus. Okay, so this would be a lecture that I normally do on Monday, March 30th. Okay, and the chapter is chapter 10, Trapped in the Past, You're Living in the Present. And I think this is a great chapter for the circumstances that we're in. Um, it has some really insightful uh, kinds of themes that I think really relate to this whole coronavirus kind of outbreak and us being separate from one another. Okay, so, well, first off, I did want to apologize. I didn't actually get a chance to talk about some of your log entries when you turned in log 7. Now, I'm still grading log 8 at this point. So I will give you an update on that in a couple of lectures, or the next one most likely. So I just wanted to say that it's always fun reading these logs, and of course I don't name any names, but I just wanted to kind of go over some of these things that people were experiencing. So log 7, if you'll remember, let me remind you, this is where people were doing the mindful movement, the breath and body, the 3-minute breathing meditation, which is really good. Breathing space is what they call it. And then the habit releaser was watching the TV one time a week, where you set aside that time to just watch something and then be done with it, right? And so I know we went over this in class. Some people shared, and that was great. And so I did just want to point out a couple of things from that log. Some people were realized that they focused more on the TV show, and this happens to me a lot. I tend to be on my phone, or I'm just kind of like worrying about the next day and what I need to do. But when I actually schedule time to watch something, um, it's really nice when I just sit there and just do that and do nothing else, because it makes me realize, like, wow, I haven't really been paying attention. And somebody, mentioned this. They're like, I didn't realize how much I just didn't know about the show that I've been watching for a while. And then I finally scheduled some time to really watch it. And now I'm kind of lost, right? Um, so people became really mindful of this. Some people didn't understand the point, and that's totally fine. Maybe you are more living in the present, or maybe you weren't in that moment, and you're just kind of like, well, why do I have to schedule this time, and what am I doing? And that's okay. The fact that you notice those things is part of mindfulness, right? Um, some people found it hard not to binge, and that's just some really basic psychological principles. So I was actually listening to a podcast that brought this up, and Netflix, Hulu, all these various streaming sites tend to play on using some of these psychological phenomenon that happen. They use it to their advantage, is what I mean. And so they have those things where, they'll continue to the next episode, or they'll continue to the next video that they suggest for you. And the reason they do this is because over time you'll stop, you'll just kind of allow it to happen, right? It just kind of automatically goes into the next episode, and you're like, well, I'm not going to let this stop. And so we end up binging. We end up just watching one thing over and over and over again, and we build a habit, right? So the habit is that we just let it play. And so it's really interesting when we're forced to just watch one episode and you schedule it and you're done. You have to click away from that. It feels so strange, partially because it's a habit now. You allow that, program to keep running. That just recently happened to me while I was, just letting something run in the background, trying to upload stuff and whatnot. And I realized that I had been listening for 2 or 3 episodes, and I'm like, wow, how did this happen? And I found it really strange when I had to hit pause. So it was kind of interesting to get a sense of what people were thinking when they actually did the TV habit releaser. And this is why it's fun to do those habit releasers. It makes you get out of your comfort zone, get out of those habits that we've formed that can sometimes just be kind of detrimental, right? Some people weren't enjoying, like, the body, the movement, mindful movement meditation. So they're kind of like, some people really actually felt like they were noticing their pain. Um, and some people felt like that 5 meditations was like super overwhelming, and I feel you. um, but part of the point of all of this is to sit for sustained moments of time, not to calm your mind. Remember, that's not the goal. The goal is to be mindful in that moment. We're going to sit with ourselves, and we're going to do these movements and things like that, right? So some people felt like they had to force themselves to do it, which is totally fine. That happens as well. Some people, mentioned they wanted to keep watching, like when they're doing the TV habit releaser. And some people noticed more positive things, like they felt more in control of their body when they were doing the mindful movement, which is kind of nice, right? Because we do control our bodies. Even though we do things automatically, we are who we are, right? And we can stop things. So this is really, really interesting to get a sense for what people are noticing. Some people realize that maybe they don't like the body scans. That was one comment. Or they get tired of doing the meditations. And again, like that, forcing yourself to do it. And that's perfectly fine. This isn't for everybody. I hope that some of you continue to do this practice or come back to it when you need to over time. And some of you might just be like, nah, not for me. And that's totally fine too. Maybe you can pass it along to somebody who might be find it more useful, right? But I hope through at least this experience, this kind of changes your mind about what mindfulness is all about and, how it's used, as well as how we're relating it and kind of critically thinking about it in psychology and law. Okay. So now I want to turn to the chapter. Okay, chapter 10. Again, we're in week 11. I know this gets all confusing. We're in week 11, so this is 3:30 through 4:3. This is that week, right? So if you go to your week 11 folder, this is where you found this video, and you've got all sorts of goodies there. Okay. This week, we're going to focus on, trapped in the past or living in the present. Okay. And really, this chapter is about compassion and loving kindness and focusing on that. Now, I know we've talked about that. It's been kind of sprinkled in your book, and these are concepts that have come up in the articles that we've read, but this chapter really focuses on them in the practices. And I'm altering some of the practices so that they don't seem so overwhelming for everyone, and some are optional. Okay. Then on Wednesday, we'll finish up, or you all actually have one whole video devoted to victims. So that counts for this week as well. And then you'll have an article by Toomey and Anhalt that looks at mindfulness in young victims, okay, on Friday. So make sure you do that article review number 10 on Toomey and Anhalt in 2016. So let's go over some of these concepts in chapter 10. I hope you have your book handy. I know I have mine right in front of me. Now, this book opens up with a really, really tragic story, speaking about a woman who had taken an overdose, and she was having all these kinds of regrets afterwards and feeling quite silly, quite stupid for having attempted to take her own life. Okay. And this was trying to illustrate a point. Sometimes we are hard on ourselves, right? Events happen, we say something, we do something, and we start to believe that it's not okay to forgive. Okay. It's not okay to forgive ourselves for maybe things that we have done, or maybe for past failures, right? Maybe we worry about things in the future. Okay. And so this is why this chapter is aptly named Trapped in the Past or Living in the Present. Sometimes our past, quote unquote mistakes can seem rather like a cage, right? We're trapped in them, and we tend to kind of circle round and round through them. And so sometimes, right, the book talks about this idea of painful engagement. Okay, and if you're looking at your book, this was on page 188. Okay, and they actually define it. If you want to go further, and hopefully you've been looking at these footnotes, if you flip all the way to page 261, under chapter 10, number 3, it defines painful engagement for you. Okay, and so now I'm quoting the authors. This is painful engagement refers to the feeling that your goals are unattainable, yet at the same time, you can't, you're not able to let them go, for your happiness feels like it depends on that. Okay. And so, think about that, right? Again, that's really linked to this idea that we can't let some things go. And so, again, mindfulness isn't about passive resignation. We talked about that in the last chapter. It's not about you kind of sitting back and saying, well, can't do anything. But at the same time, it's not about hanging on to these past mistakes and these things, right? And so that's what we tend to do, though. We tend to feel like it's not okay to forgive ourselves for maybe some mistakes we've made and things that we've currently done that are now kind of, these past failures, right? And so we live with this guilt. They talk about fear, shame, and guilt a lot in this chapter. And it's almost like we're taught to do that in Western society. We're taught to live with guilt and shame. And, I mean, this could be a little cultural too. From my Mexican heritage, there's always jokes and stereotypes about how like guilt ridden we are as Catholics, because a high percentage of Mexican Americans or Mexicans tend to be Catholic, right? And so there's always a stereotype, this joke about this guilt. But, it extends to Western thinking, right? We tend to be more difficult on ourselves for something, right? We didn't accomplish something, we fucked up. And it's kind of like, okay, so what? If you feel like you fail, maybe, in the context of university, what's most salient to you might be that you get a grade that were hoping to get a higher grade on, right? You got a lower grade than what you expected. And so that violates our expectations. And then we think of that as a failure. And then we, kind of go into the spiral of like, we suck and, this sucks and I suck. And then we catastrophize, right? And so, this is why it's good to kind of take a step back and really consider, well, are these thoughts true? And this is part of this idea of this painful engagement, and our seemingly inability to move past some of these past, quote unquote failures, mistakes, whatever you want to call them. If you look at Western civilizations, Eastern, if you look at more Eastern philosophies and ways of thinking, right, where mindfulness came out of, they care more about the process of things. So, I mean, if you watch an anime, for instance, those are usually created in Japan, and with that come these Japanese values, which tend to be more Eastern thought, and they tend to be rooted in these ideas of you got to work hard, you've got to keep working at it, as opposed to more Western thought of like, oh, you either have it or you don't, right? It's this black-white thinking. Instead, you should think about your path as, okay, so what if you, quote unquote, failed at something? You got a C minus when you were really shooting for a B. Well, that just means, okay, well, what did you do in the past that might have led to the C minus, and what can you do now to fix that, to change that? Right. So I have a lot of students that panic after exam one, exam two, when maybe they get a C and they're not used to C's. And I'm like, okay, well, let's look at what you can do to adjust, right? Don't panic, don't freak out and think this is the end of the world. It's more about, all right, well, that didn't work out. What can I do now to make things better? But you have to do it continuously. But we tend to get set back, right? We don't think it's okay to forgive ourselves for that. We think we have to lay on the guilt for aeons, right? And so painful engagement is this idea where we feel like we can't reach our goals, right? Because we tend to get swallowed up in the past. So we're thinking about the past, all our past failures, and then eventually kind of come to this conclusion that we can't reach our goals. But then we don't let them go. Okay. And so one of the reasons why we're not letting them go is because we think if we do, then there goes your happiness, right? We so much believe that our happiness is linked to reaching these goals that without them we can't be happy, right? So then if you're stuck in this place where you're trying to attain some goal that you set and you're not willing to let it go, well, then you're just going to dig a deeper hole of despair, guilt, shame, and all of that, right? So this is how we can get stuck in this kind of painful engagement. And it's really enlightening to kind of think about that, to really, truly, deeply think about, wow, the past can really trap us, okay? And so let's talk about another bit of advice that the book talked about. Now, they didn't just talk about this kind of idea of painful engagement where we feel like if, we allow ourselves to be happy, then we're kind of betraying everything we know. Because we've let go of some goal or something. But, we even criticize ourselves for being happy. I mean, just check out social media for 5 minutes, and it's enough to make you go crawl back into a non-social media like hole. And that's what I've done. I have a Facebook account. I've turned it off for various reasons. And every time I go back to it, whenever I need to open it back up, I'm just disgusted by the random things that I see that are posted by friends, where people are just criticizing people over and over. I read news stories where it's like, oh, the Twitterverse is angry about something. And it's just really depressing after a while that I just can't deal with how people feed into having to criticize every single thing everybody ever does, right? There's no love and compassion out there, and it can be really daunting. Not to say that criticism isn't good. It's just when it becomes this ever, growing need to always have to criticize something, it becomes quite toxic. Right? And so the book talks about some other concepts like irreversible damage. So sometimes we believe after an event, something big, you failing a class, for instance, then after this big event, we feel like we're changed. We're so far changed, nothing can be done with this, right? It can't be undone. And again, this is why it's imperative that you don't think that mindfulness is passive resignation. Oh, we just watch our thoughts go by and that's, we're not supposed to be in doing mode. That's not the point, right? Part of this chapter is to realize that, we can change. Like sometimes we feel like we'll never be happy again. And sometimes events occur in that way. And we feel like we cannot be changed. We're forever damaged. And, part of this is rooted in some scientific evidence. So your book talks about the fact that when people tend to ruminate more, be depressed, things like that, they tend to recall memories more generally compared to more specific moments. So what we mean by this is, if I asked you to recall, a sad moment between you and your parents, you might just say, well, we argue all the time, and that makes me sad. And it's like, okay, well, but tell me a really specific moment, right? Like, oh, I remember arguing with my mom one time um, about, me being kind of pushy because I was learning all this stuff in psych, and she didn't like that. She felt like I was being like a clinician to her because I was trying to give her advice and she didn't like it, right? And that's more specific versus saying like me and my mom just argue. We argue all the time. And the problem with remembering things so generally is when you say things like, oh, well, we just argue all the time, right? Then that becomes truth in our minds. We start to think and overgeneralize things, similar to when we make these overgeneral statements of, okay, you fail at something, then you just suck. You must suck at life entirely, right? Oh, you got a poor grade on an exam. Well, you're the worst human being in the world. And that's the thought you have. And, or you might have, right? And then everything spirals from there. That's overgeneralizing, and that's catastrophizing, right? You're becoming overly general versus being able to identify very specific moments of good, bad, whatever you want to kind of label it. Right? And so this can become really problematic. So the reason why this is important to bring up is because people who tend to recall their memories more generally compared to more specific memories when asked to, recall these kinds of things, is they tend to then also have more difficulty in letting go of the past, right? And so then we're stuck in the past when we have these, when there's this correlation between letting go of past things and having these very overgeneral memories. Also, people who tend to recall memories more generally in this way also tend to have difficulty in being able to cope with things that are going wrong in their lives in the present. Okay. And so they tend to not bounce back very well or, quickly from negative events that currently happen to them if we tend to recall memories in this very general way. Okay. And so this can become really problematic, right? It can really impair our ability to think of things as changeable because we overgeneralize these memories and just say everything's bad, everything just kind of gets dumped on me. So aptly named the chapter it is, we're trapped in the past, right? We think that things cannot change. So, oops, sorry about that. So the idea in the book is to be kind to yourself, even when life continues to throw whatever it will at you, because it will, sometimes good, sometimes bad, if you want to kind of boil it down to this dichotomy. But the idea behind the chapter is to cultivate compassion and kindness towards yourself first. Now, I really liked if you all turn to page 192, there's the box that's called the Dance of Ideas, and I really like this. And I think this is where I annoy my parents and other people um, a lot when I'm in conversations with them. They tell you to imagine yourself in a crowded bar. You see a friend talking to one of your work colleagues, and you try and wave at them, but they don't, they're looking at you in your direction, but they don't seem to notice you, right? So then they ask you, well, what thoughts might come to mind? And depending on your current state of mind, you might have a couple different thoughts. Some people, maybe who are like having a pretty good time, they're pretty happy, they might just be like, oh, they probably didn't see me. It's a crowded bar. My friend has really poor eyesight, and so they tend to not even be able to see anything like 5 feet in front of them, let alone across the room, right? Other people who maybe are not having such a great day might kind of think, oh God, they're probably just ignoring me. And this is it, like everybody does. I'm just the worst person in the world. Nobody wants to talk to me. You see? So your thoughts start to kind of get wrapped up, right? And so that can really start to continue on into this downward spiral. And again, mindfulness helps us kind of stop that dead in its tracks, right? And so it's really interesting the way that they provide this example. And they talk about, in the section that says when the dance freezes, they say that, it's really interesting to see all of these ideas come to mind and all these thoughts come to mind. But then what'll happen is with this overgeneralizing of your memories, then that tends to say that like you've now summarized the past and you believe that to be true. It's what it is. People don't like you, and so they ignore you when, that's why they didn't wave from you across the room, even though it's just one instance, one time, right, where this happens. Like I might have friends who aren't very good at texting me back, and I know this. But sometimes when I text them and I'm hoping for a reply, maybe one day I'm just feeling really lonely and sad and I'm trying to reach out and they don't reply to me. I might just think, oh, there we go. They just hate me. They don't like me, and you start spiraling, right? Versus maybe, they have something going on in their lives, right? Maybe they have some medical issues or they're just forgetful and they just tend to not be good at texting. But man, when you give them a phone call, they're right there. So the idea here is to catch this kind of pattern of thinking and to treat yourself with loving kindness, to learn compassion and to practice compassion. Now, there's the key. All of this boils down to practice. It's all about practicing, right? And so now we have various tools. Last week, we were facing our difficulties. Again, not passive resignation. You're just watching and noticing things and how you react to difficulties in your life. And now we're turning towards giving yourself compassion, granting yourself the ability to say, it's okay to feel these ways, and they're temporary, right? It doesn't mean that they're forever. Nothing lasts forever, right? So we can practice this kind of kindness and compassion with ourselves. And on page 195, they have another box that tries to get you to ask some questions of yourself. Like, do you find yourself criticizing yourself for having irrational or inappropriate emotions? Like, do you feel like you beat yourselves up for having these kinds of emotions? So this might really catch some males, for instance, and I don't mean to stereotype, but the sometimes we socialize males to kind of shove their emotions down. I know particularly in my culture, that tends to be the thing. You shove your emotions down. You're not supposed to show them because you're a strong guy, and it's this machismo. Okay, if anybody knows anything about Mexican culture. And so it's a stereotype, obviously, but you do see that a little bit. You do see some people don't think it's okay. Japanese culture, for instance, they tend to really, stifle their emotional reactance to things, and they do it in a different kind of way, right? And I don't think they're giving themselves a hard time. They don't show it as much, right? So there are differences. And so you can ask yourself these questions. Do you criticize yourself for what you consider irrational or inappropriate emotions? Do you tell yourself that you shouldn't be feeling this way? Do you believe that some of your thoughts are abnormal or bad and you shouldn't think this way, right? In other words, you're kind of judging yourself for feeling, thinking, reacting. And again, that's up to this point. We've been trying to train ourselves in mindful awareness, just noticing the thoughts in a non-judgmental way as they come into your mind. And this is key, right? Because now when we're talking about compassion, do you notice those thoughts? Thinking back to all your practices, do you notice giving yourself a hard time during meditations, right? Saying, I'm never going to do this right. That's the art of mindfulness, right? You're practicing noticing whether or not you have these kinds of thoughts, right? And so part of this questionnaire is to try and figure out if you're being too harsh on yourself and not realizing that some of these things you're saying to yourself is harsh, is criticism, right? And so trying to see what your responses are is really just more you being aware of them. And then you watch them, right? You don't feed into them, you just watch them and practice them with loving kindness in mind. Okay, so practicing the act of kindness and compassion really is, again, a practice to help you remember to be kind to yourself. Okay, and it starts with yourself. So you're going to practice this kindness and this compassion this week. And through practice, we get better, right? That's why when you take tests over and over and over again, you get better at them. If you take a test on the same subject over and over and over again, you get better at it. If you ride your bike over and over and over again, you can eventually not hang on to your handlebars. I've been working on that recently. It's kind of fun and scary, but the more and more you do it, the better able you are to control that bike, for instance, to do whatever it is you're practicing. You want to learn piano? Well, it's not going to just happen. You got to practice it, right? And so all of this is practice. Just like practicing a piano to learn some tunes, practicing loving kindness and compassion to yourself helps you to remember and to build that automatic, ability to be kind to yourself. We're not typically taught to be kind. Maybe some people, have that grandma, their mom, that kind of does teach you to have kindness and empathy for others, right? We tend to more often than not push and criticize ourselves. We might feel this guilt and shame for not trying hard enough, for not being good enough, for not being able to cope. So, let's try and let go of some of this guilt or shame or even fear of not being enough, not being good enough, not trying hard enough, not being able to cope. And let's try that in our practices for next week, or this coming week, I should say. So again, this is log number 10. You're going to find it in your week 11 folder where you found this video most likely. And these are practices to begin on 3:30 and they can extend to 4:06. Okay, and upload these logs, log number 10, by 4:06. So here's what I want y'all to do. Definitely practice the befriending meditation one time a day for 6 days between this range. Okay, and so there's a description of the befriending meditation that starts on 198 and 199 that you should, or goes to 200, that you should have read through. But if not, maybe you'll be a little surprised when you listen to it. But again, you're going to be practicing this loving kindness towards yourself, and you might bring other people to mind, like a stranger. Okay, so we're going to practice this loving kindness, this compassion. You're going to befriend yourself and others in this meditation. Again, one time a day for 6 days. Now, also required of you is to practice that 3-minute breathing space one time a day for 6 days. And again, you can use this as much as you want to. I love the 3-minute breathing space, and I love the little additions that get tacked onto it as well. So just to let you know, for the breathing space, if you've read on page 206 to 207, they talk about you doing an additional things after completing your breathing space meditation. And so what you can do, you'll do your practice, your 3-minute meditation. And so you have other kinds of options, right? So they said that, one of the options when you did the breathing space meditation was after you're done with it, you just carry on with what you were doing before you began your meditation, but you're just more aware, right? You're focused, you're going to focus on, let's say, reading for another class, what have you. Your second option is to maybe just drop into your body to feel what it's feeling, what its current state is, right? And that goes back to that relating to your body chapter. And then for this week, though, we're going to focus on this other kind of thing you can do after you've completed the breathing space. Okay, so they want you to really relate to your thoughts. Now, what they mean by that is after the breathing space, take a couple moments, okay? Take an extra minute, and maybe note your thoughts and feel free to write these down in your log. Okay, this can be part of what you record, right? And see if you can relate differently to your thoughts. Write them down, watch them as they come and go, view them as just some kind of thought that comes and goes, not actual reality. Name your thoughts, right? Are they worrying thoughts? Are they anxious? I liked the idea of naming them as morbid thoughts because sometimes I have some real weird thoughts about, harm that can befall my family. And I'm like, wow, why am I thinking about this? This is making me anxious, right? And so that was a really nice label. I'm like, morbid thoughts, that's a good name, right? Or just thinking. If it's too much trouble for you to label it, because that happens to me. I'm like, I don't know what kind of thought this is. I'm just thinking. It's just me thinking. Sometimes I'll just say it's anxiety. It's just anxious Vicky, right? And ultimately they say, like, you can ask yourself whether you're overtired. Are you jumping to conclusions? Are you overgeneralizing? Are you exaggerating the significance of the situation? Are you unreasonably expecting perfection, right? Are you giving yourself a hard time? In other words, write these thoughts down, label them, and then try and figure out, like, are you being a little harsh on yourself? Can we practice some loving kindness, right? Have a different relationship with your thoughts. Okay, so those are the only two that are required this week, one time a day for 6 days, okay? The optional ones are what they suggest you do in the chapter. So they say do track 1 or track 4 right before the befriending meditation. So you can pair up either track 1 with befriending or track 4 with befriending. And you can do that in a series. Up to you if you want to, or you can just dive right into befriending. I do recommend that you do 1 or 4 right before befriending because it's nice to get yourself in a good headspace to practice, watching your thoughts, getting a sense for your, the climate in your head at the moment. And then that'll help you get real focused and in a mindful place to continue with the befriending meditation. This one and the exploring difficulties has by far been my top favorite meditations, and the 3-minute breathing space. I do these quite a bit because I think these are less practiced in my life than I'd like them to be. So track 1 or 4 optional, and you can tick off the box, and do one of the habit releasers. Okay, so, well, before I go on to that, so you have 2 options for the habit releasers. They're detailed on page 207 to 209. Okay, so the first one's called Reclaiming Your Life. And they want you to think back to a time in your life when things were less like super hectic, before maybe like a tragedy occurred, or you got a new job, or you took on more classes, whatever it is, something that kind of took over your life, right? So for example, for me, this one's always real difficult for me to do. Graduate school. Before graduate school, my life was very different. I worked full time and getting my undergraduate degree. I was going to school full time and I was working full time. Okay. And so, the work though was just work. It was just to pay the bills. And then my school was my school, and that was it. I could go out on the weekends with friends. I had a good time working at the various places I worked because I made really good friends there. We had fun, and I could just do stuff. Sometimes I'd go off and watch a movie on my own. Sometimes I'd just go sit at a cafe and read, and it was fantastic. Then when I hit graduate school, I mean, that didn't stop exactly, but slowly work started taking over. If you ever go to graduate school, let me tell you, you work while you're in graduate school, but you're usually a researcher or a teaching assistant. So your life is completely consumed with what you're learning and getting work done in that way. And so you're always, conducting a study, publishing your work, going to school still because you're still taking classes, writing a thesis, writing other papers for classes, ultimately writing your dissertation, having to defend those things, going to conferences. The list goes on. And so I would work every single day, every day. There would not be one day, I lost my weekends, wouldn't be one day out of the week that I wasn't working on something related to school. And that's just the life, and it doesn't have to be everybody's life, but that was my life. So circling back to the habit releaser, that was my memory. it was really hard for me to think about like, what did I used to do before graduate school? Because that continued on to when I got, an assistant professor position. I continued to work on the weekends. So did my husband. And we eventually took one day back. We took Saturdays back. And that's why y'all don't hear from me on Saturdays. And sometimes you hear from me on Sundays. Um, we take our Saturdays back in a sense that we don't do any work. We hang out, we cook stuff, we go out to the movies, we go out for walks, we have a good time, we play video games, and so we took that back. And we also then started taking our evenings back because I used to work till like 10, 12, whatever, it didn't matter. But then we started to set a cutoff point to say, hey, it's time to be together, it's time to live our lives, right? And so think of a time in as much detail as you can, right? Some of the things you used to do before you got so darn busy, and really focus on something you haven't done in a really long time. So one thing I haven't done, and this is what I'm going to do this week, I'm real excited about it, is I like to make rubber stamps. Okay, I make all sorts of stamps, and maybe if you all would like, I'll post this maybe on my Instagram or something. I'll show you some of my stamps. But I like making rubber stamps. I like carving them. I'm not an artist. I just got into it because I like stamps. I'm obsessed. Okay, and so think of something that you really want to do. Maybe you liked to read your favorite magazines, the book suggests, you listen to some music, you go out with friends or bike rides, you play board games. Maybe it's like you just enjoy a good cup of coffee, right? You go and like taste all the different coffees around town. I know that's a little hard to do right now, considering that we're kind of under lockdown. But if you can still get takeout, maybe do that. Or maybe just sit and kind of like stare at the ceiling and hum to yourself, whatever you want to do. Right? Think of something that you haven't done in a really long time. Coloring. I don't know, anything. Choose one of these activities and plan to do it this week. You can do it more than once. You can do it just one time, but it's optional. Okay, so this is just totally optional. All right, so tack this on. Another thing you can do that's optional, this might be a little difficult given that we're trying to maintain social distance, right? Which should be our duties. We should be doing that. But maybe do something nice for someone else. That's another one of the habit releasers. So maybe somebody's out of toilet paper because people are hoarding toilet paper for whatever reason. I have no idea why. Thank goodness I bought a bunch of toilet paper before all of this happened. But maybe if somebody's running low, throw them, if you've got some spare toilet paper, lend them a roll, right? And just do it in a really socially responsible way. Maybe just like toss it to them wearing gloves and make sure they spray it with Lysol or something. Whatever you want to do. Maybe one of your friends is having a bad day. Send them a goofy picture of yourself. Reach out to them. Reach out to somebody else. We still got the digital scapes, right? And do something nice. Maybe if you can donate to charity, give a kid something like a little toy, whatever. There's lots of ways we can help, only if you can. If you can't, don't even worry about it. Don't try. Be kind to yourself. Remember, do the other habit releaser. Do something for you. Okay. And so I know I'm going on, and you're probably really bored staring at this screen, and you're probably like, oh my God, when is it going to end? But these are your practices for this week. Make sure you check off the little boxes I've provided on the log when you complete each practice. So let me show that to you real quick. Here's the log. Remember, it's week 10. We're in week 11. I know things are weird. It's due Monday 4/6. You're starting it on March 30th. Okay, remember, hear all your instructions. And again, just check stuff off. Body and breath or the other meditation are optional right before the befriending, and so is the habit releaser optional. Just write in what you do for your habit releaser and give any details you want if you happen to do it. But befriending, meditation, 3-minute breathing space, those things you gots to do for 6 days. Okay, so make sure you grab the right log. This is starting 3:30. You'll upload it 4/6. Okay. All right, y'all. So that's it. That's all I've got for you in this edition of Vicki rambling on and on about chapter 10. But I hope this chapter was insightful, and I look forward to doing another one of these videos on the next topic. See you all later.